The cypresses breathed like dark lungs in the Gardens of Lucullus, and the city beyond them muttered in its sleep. Torches jittered along a gravel path, flame reflected in a basin where carp turned like slow coins. A woman in a pale mantle stood with her mother, the fabric hooding her face as if to spare her from recognition and from memory. Messalina did not cry. She touched the rim of the basin the way a priestess might touch an altar, steady as stone, and listened to the footfalls of men who had already decided what she had been. Rome had made its mind up quickly. Rome always did. If you ask the chroniclers, men with knives sharpened into sentences. This is the night the monster is slain, the empress whose hunger ate the city. But listen closely to the leaves and the water. Both are older than rumor. Both have heard other endings. What happened in these gardens was not a cleansing, but an arrangement. When the message finally came, no audience with the emperor, no trial, no chance to speak. Messalina's jaw tightened, and the moon found her cheekbone like a blade. "So be it," she said. Or perhaps she said nothing at all. Tacitus gives her a practiced silence. Juvenal invents a roar. We only know that she was 20-something, that there was a sword, and that Rome walked away believing it had tidied a mess. To understand the mess, you start with a throne too heavy for the man who sat on it, so his enemies said. Claudius, mocked since childhood for his limp and his stammer, wore learning like armor. Books were his province. Policy became his remedy. In 41 CE, after the horror pageant of Caligula, he rose not by senatorial election, but by the rough ratification of soldiers who found him hiding behind a curtain and decided a timid scholar could be turned into a reliable king. He proved them wrong by being competent, repairing finances, adjudicating laws with patience, and in 43 CE, sending legions across watery edges to make Britannia part of Rome's map rather than Rome's nightmare. Competence rarely endears. To the great families who believed offices were heirlooms, Claudius's reliance on freedmen, Narcissus with his meticulous ledgers, Pallas with his cold intelligence, and Callistus with his practiced smile, felt like salt rubbed into ancestral pride. Into that palace walked Valeria Messalina, a name that sounded like silk when it should have sounded like iron. She was young, too young for the rooms she entered, and impeccably placed. Through Octavia, sister of Augustus, her blood ran in sanctioned channels. Her marriage to Claudius, decades her senior, was a political clasp that locked family ambition to imperial necessity. Whatever tenderness existed between them is unknowable. What is sure is that their union produced 2 children, Octavia and Britannicus, living guarantees against instability. The city understood this language. A woman's body could be pressed into coin and treaty, stamped with dynastic promise. Rome minted her face alongside her husband's and called it honor. We can draw her in mosaics of facts. A statue dedication in a Greek city praising the emperor's wife. A coinage type that pairs her profile with the small, solemn head of her son. But mosaics are assembled from broken things. The whole picture comes to us through men built for dispute. Senators who bled status under the new order and learned to staunch it with stories. Their craft was to turn politics into morality plays. Faced with an empress who advocated, intervened, and negotiated within the limits and levers available to her, they reached for the most effective solvent in Roman public life. Sex as accusation, desire as treason. In this, they were not inventing a new technique. They were perfecting an old one. The city had long disciplined unruly women by confining them to the flesh its writers imagined for them. Cleopatra's strategy becomes sorcery, her diplomacy reduced to enchantment. Later, an Iceni queen's leadership is recast as feral grievance. So it is with Messalina. Her petitions become appetites, her alliances become assignations. A satirist claims she slipped from the marble bedrooms of the Palatine to the grease-smudged mat of a brothel and returned at dawn victorious in an obscene contest. The line lands. The image sticks. It does not matter that satire announces itself as theater. The audience is ready to applaud. But scandal is rarely born of a single pen. The palace was a marketplace where everyone traded. Freedmen bartered access for outcomes, senators traded indignation for survival. Relatives swapped favors like coin. Messalina learned early that appearances were not just surfaces, they were weapons. She hosted dinners where enemies were seated together like gladiators in gleaming cups. And the wrong compliment could serve as an opening thrust. She smiled where it was required and did not smile when she should have. And for that lapse, the visible intention, the city kept a ledger. Decisions echo through the sources, stripped of context. A governor dismissed, a rival exiled, a friend elevated to a priesthood that meant more in Rome than prayers. Each entry could be politics as usual, each could be something else. We are denied the receipts. The child in the middle of this accounting was Britannicus. He had time written into him, time that would carry the Julio-Claudian project through another generation. For those who preferred other heirs, that time was a threat. Enter Agrippina, Messalina's older cousin, disciplined, ferociously competent, and in possession of a son named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the boy the world would come to know as Nero. Agrippina survived Caligula. She understood how to stand very still while the men around her committed affectations of grandeur that made them fall. Where Messalina's youth made her visible, Agrippina's gravity made her inevitable. Rome is a place where inevitabilities collide. All of this lies behind the most theatrical charge. That Messalina married Gaius Silius, handsome, childless, politically convenient, while Claudius breathed and governed. Treason dressed as wedding. The story's best versions are drenched in petals, drowning in wine, chorused by the laughter of those too possessed by the present to imagine the morning. It is perfect on the page. Perhaps too perfect. You can find scholars who argue the entire episode was misread ritual, a convenient festival recast as felony. Others present it as a bid to lock the succession around Britannicus by tying Messalina to a man the soldiers admired, before Agrippina's circle tightened. And then there is the coldest option, that the freedman Narcissus, feeling his authority threatened, seized on a rumor and sculpted it into a verdict. Here is what the record does not dispute. In 48 CE, the accusation detonated. Claudius was away. He hesitated. Narcissus did not. Orders moved faster than deliberation. Silius died. The circle constricted around Messalina until the garden became the size of a noose. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, stood somewhere near enough to witness, but not near enough to intercede. A centurion waited with a blade and an instruction that preferred self-execution, but did not require it. When courage is written by enemies, it is difficult to quote. Some say she faltered, and the soldier finished the task. Some say she extended her throat, as if submitting to a barber's practiced hand. Either way, she vanished from the living city and entered the theater of its memory. And the memory was meticulously curated. Names chiseled away from pedestals, faces rubbed to formlessness, the careful bureaucracies of forgetting set in motion. In the vacuum, story volunteered as archive. Senators who had protested the emperor's household now sighed with relief and denounced the dead. Freedmen preserved their stations by presenting themselves as surgeons who had removed rot from a body politic. In the coming year, Agrippina would marry Claudius. In the following years, her son would edge past Britannicus toward the sun. When Britannicus died in 55, too young for natural ends, too inconvenient for political ones, the city hardly needed an explanation. It already possessed a catechism. Remove the problem, invent the moral. None of this rescues Messalina. It complicates her. The most honest portrait we can paint places a young woman inside sharp machinery. She pressed levers that cut other people. She reached for advantages the culture permitted in whispers, but punished in speeches. She maneuvered, she made enemies. She believed, perhaps, that proximity to the emperor could weather any storm. She underestimated the weather. That is not depravity. That is the ordinary tragedy of court life, scaled to imperial size and colored with the only pigments the sources would grant her: desire and shame. Return to the garden one last time. The torchlight is lower now. The basin's surface has remembered how to be dark. A breeze comes off the hill and folds the cypress shadows like a book closing. Somewhere above the city, a priest marks a calendar. A clerk files an edict. A mother wakes because her child is ill and sings a private lullaby. Life goes on, and Rome calls that justice. We will call it what it is: the beginning of a story that has been told by men who needed it to mean a particular thing. Messalina, they wrote, and they meant. Here is why power must never look like a woman. Our task is not to reverse the verdict with a better myth, but to watch closely, to count the hands that move the knife, and to see, beneath the stain of scandal, the outline of a person who learned the rules too fast and learned too late how the game ends. The night of the garden is easier to tell than the days that made it necessary. An execution is an event. A reputation is architecture, raised one brick at a time in rooms no one records. Sealed with mortar we call rumor. To follow Messalina toward the end, you have to walk back into those rooms, where a whisper could stand taller than a law, and the difference between virtue and vice was often measured not in acts, but in who told the story first. The palace of Claudius was a city grafted onto a man. Colonnades that opened into offices, cupboards of seals and tablets, antechambers where mourning could linger all afternoon because a gatekeeper decided it would. The emperor's body was both symbol and choke point. Everyone who reached him became a valve. Freedmen kept the blood moving. This offended old families less because it was new than because it worked. Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus were not ornamental advisors. They were industrial. They processed petitions, lobbied, stalled, and performed the crucial labor of making tangled reality presentable to a ruler who insisted on reading. Claudius' competence was their mandate and their mask. The Senate learned to survive by adjusting posture, pride when safe, submission when necessary. They disliked Messalina for reasons they could recite and reasons they could not. The recitable ones were classical. Too much influence, too open an involvement in appointments, the impertinence of an empress receiving embassies as if her ear were a chamber of state. The unspoken reason was the oldest. She could not be argued with in public without the city hearing a blasphemy. Man rebukes symbol of dynasty and acclaiming it as theater. So they argued with her in stories instead. Consider a winter morning in 42 CE, the case of Appius Silenus. Tacitus, folding his scorn with care, gives us a scene precise enough to chill. An early hour, a staged alarm, and the emperor's wife and a freedman, Messalina and Narcissus, bursting into Claudius's presence to announce a vision. The godlike prince had been in danger through the night. A man had been seen, dagger in hand, approaching the imperial bed. Before the Senate, before evidence, the script arrived, complete. Moments later, Appius was apprehended. A charge became a sentence. Silanus died. The beauty of the mechanism was its piety. A premonitory dream, conveniently reported by those nearest to the emperor, turned a political removal into divine self-defense. Did Messalina plot it? The sources insist she did, and that her motive was both personal affront and strategic elimination. Even if she did not write the whole script, she stood near the stage, and her shadow fits the light. It was not the last time a woman's body would be used to anchor a policy. Julia Livilla, Caligula's sister, was exiled under Claudius, charged with adultery. Her name bore dynastic voltage. Her proximity to power made her a sponsor for anyone's ambitions but Messalina's. Add Seneca the Younger to the ledger, a mind too sharp to leave unblunted, accused of an affair with Julia and sent to the far edge of Rome's patience, a windy rock in the Tyrrhenian Sea. The allegation knotted sex to state. A liaison became a treason-adjacent offense because it threatened the fragile geometry of succession. Once again, sources point to Messalina as an instigator, plausibly because removing Julia removed a rival banner, and blunting Seneca kept a future rhetorician from furnishing better language for other causes. Note how the charges rhyme: adultery, conspiracy, nocturnal danger, God's whispering warnings. Rome perfected its prosecution kits centuries before it gave them these names. And under Claudius, they were deployed with artisanal regularity. No dossier needed to be airtight if it was fragrant. The right perfume, danger to the emperor, offense against pudicitia, chastity, sacrilege, could make a crowd nod. Moral panic was not the opposite of law. It was a kind of law, one that moved faster than tablets and signatures, especially when the supposed offender was a woman whose very political agency read, to the city's eye, as erotic overstep. Messalina learned from this with devastating speed. She learned that a favor was safest when it looked like someone else's idea. She learned the dividend of gratitude was small, and the interest on resentment compounding. She learned that a woman's influence must be portable, present in others' mouths, distributed across small offices, hidden in the casual phrasing of a decree. She also learned how quickly these tactics would be edited in hostile retellings into appetite. Sometimes the edits were shameless. A man she supported becomes kept. A petition she shaped becomes pillow talk. If she attended a sacrifice, the rumor machine found a sensual interpretation for the priest's hesitation and discovered, in the smoke of burnt grain, a sign that her eyes had strayed. If a senator was demoted after crossing her, it was not because he had lost a policy fight, but because she could not stomach resistance without converting it to lust. A woman, the city decided, could not value anything purely for power's sake, not command, not legacy, not a son's future. She must desire bodies, so they gave her bodies in their versions of the story and called it evidence. Yet politics requires bodies of another sort, soldiers and handsome standard bearers. In Gaius Silius, the capital found both. He was the kind of man who arrives at a banquet and rearranges the temperature. The chroniclers oblige us with a description. The most beautiful Roman of his time, the kind of beauty that becomes a job. But beauty alone builds nothing. He was also unmarred by children, legally unencumbered, useful to any plan requiring quick movement. His circle included officers who respected him more instinctively than they respected accountants with seals. In another universe, he would have been the ideal son-in-law. In ours, he became a kind of mirror in which the court could see whatever it needed to fear. What did Messalina see? The cautious answer is options. Britannicus was a promise, but promises in Rome were fragile. An empress could not command legions, but she could arrange affections. Silius offered a charisma that could be converted into something like a guarantee, if not of today's safety, then of tomorrow's. To bind herself to him, formally or informally, was to draw a line on the map that some men in armor might choose to defend, should the succession wobble. That is the political arithmetic the sources refuse to do, preferring to show us an empress enslaved by desire rather than a mother measuring risk. Around this nascent alliance, the freedmen's weather vanes spun. Narcissus, who had survived by keeping the emperor's ear as private property, calculated his exposure and did not enjoy the result. A charismatic noble tied by proximity to the empress threatened to turn whispers into commands. Pallas, cooler, wealthier, careful to look irreplaceable, could afford hesitation. Callistus practiced neutrality itself. In such a climate, the smallest gesture became a barometer reading. A glance at a banquet, an appointment delayed by a day, a petition suddenly lost. Each signaled where the gusts were pushing, and men with fortunes at stake adjusted like sailors who see a reef no one else will admit exists. Meanwhile, the city saw what the city always sees: surfaces. Messalina's public piety was adequate, if not spectacular. She sponsored the obvious charities, made the necessary show of modesty, performed motherhood with the competent tenderness of someone who understood every eye was also a pen. Still, the chronicles find their shadows. If she laughed too long, it became dissipation. If she did not laugh, it was pride. If she intervened on behalf of a client from an old family, it was promiscuous affiliation. If she supported a freedman's candidate, it was class treason backed by bed. The map of allowable behavior had no room for the topography of a woman in power. And yet, listen closely, and you can hear a different register under the din. Coins, struck in 42 show her paired with Britannicus. Mother and son, the city's future captured in small portable bronze. Inscriptions from the provinces praise her under the polite formulae reserved for imperial women. Nothing excessive, nothing unusual. Yet proof that beyond the claustrophobia of the Palatine, she was received as the empire expected to receive its empress. A conduit for favor, a face that made the remote approachable. Those fragments feel almost tender now. They are the only pieces that do not arrive wreathed in accusation. The nearer we draw to 48, the quicker the tempo. Claudius's administrative successes made him less manageable than his enemies hoped, but never invulnerable. Grain had to move. Jurists needed to be promoted. A war across the water kept producing both triumphs and invoices. The emperor's attention was a finite resource. The fight for it, infinite. In that pressure, the Silius problem matured. If Messalina did bind herself to him in some kind of ceremony, private or ritual, serious or symbolic, it would have been one of those palace gestures that can be both genuine and tactical. The tacticians against her only had to point and call it treason. They did not need to prove intent. They could narrate it. This is the theater of accusation, perfected. The first act, create urgency. The emperor is in danger. The second, moralize. Our wives are not safe if the empress is faithless. The third, ritualize. The gods have been insulted. By the fourth act, the audience is so invested that the conclusion, death without a hearing, feels like catharsis. A woman is converted into a plot device. The city applauds the craftsmanship. We are not required to clap. Look again at the day Appius Silenus died and understand it as pilot episode. Notice how dreams were cited, how night was used, how proximity to the emperor was dramatized into menace. Now take that script and enlarge it until it fits an empress. The same props, the same lighting, the same insistence that fear be resolved not by inquiry, but by blood. When the final performance opened in the Gardens of Lucullus, the audience already knew their lines. But we are not done with the setup. To understand the choice that cornered her, we have to sit in one more room, a private dining chamber on the Palatine, where wine darkens the lips and the air is congested with spiced steam. Silius sits close enough to be plausible, far enough to be deniable. Narcissus, summoned late, watches the geometry of chairs and calculates. Messalina, composed, measures how long the emperor laughs at someone else's joke and files the data with her other omens. No one says anything actionable. Everyone leaves with a conclusion anyway. In such rooms, destinies were written on napkins and burned in braziers, the smoke carrying them up to a ceiling painted with gods who never once descended to correct the record. From here, the story will accelerate until the garden is unavoidable. But before we go there, fix in your mind the machinery. Freedmen who governed attention, senators who governed indignation, a city that governed itself with panic, and a woman who believed, fatally, that she could stand in the wind and not be redefined by it. When Silius steps out of the wings in the next act, it will feel like a love story. It isn't. It is a succession plan, written in a language Rome preferred to misread. The stories Rome tells about love are rarely about love. They are about power, who holds it, who threatens it, who dares to reshape it into another form. In the months before her death, Messalina's name became inseparable from one man's, Gaius Silius. Handsome, unencumbered, politically viable, he entered the narrative like a weapon unsheathed. To her enemies, he was more than a lover. He was a candidate, and in Rome, candidates were always threats. Tacitus, with the careful venom of a senator who preferred meaning to evidence, paints Silius as the most beautiful Roman of his age. Beauty so stark, it was political. This was not poetic flattery. Rome believed physical perfection announced divine favor. A man who carried it could summon allegiance simply by entering a room. Add to this his patrician lineage and lack of children, no entangling heirs, no dynastic complications. And he became an ideal figure around whom loyalty could coalesce. What did Messalina see in him? The easy answer, the one the sources prefer, is lust. But the architecture of power suggests something colder, more deliberate. Britannicus was a child. Claudius, older and often underestimated, would not reign forever. Agrippina and her son Nero had begun their long shadow play, weaving networks among those dissatisfied with Messalina's dominance. Silius represented more than desire. He was an alternative axis. With him, Britannicus's claim could be insulated by muscle and charisma. Without him, the child was exposed to whispers sharpened into daggers. In the palace, the freedmen sniffed the change in weather. Narcissus, long Claudius's interpreter and filter, understood the danger immediately. A noble ally like Silius would make Messalina less dependent on him. If she forged her own coalition, Narcissus's role as indispensable counselor dissolved. For a freedman elevated above his station, indispensability was oxygen. Without it, he would choke. His hostility toward Messalina sharpened into something strategic. Pallas, with his measured elegance, read the situation differently. He had invested in Agrippina before, quietly, cautiously. Her survival under Caligula and her lineage as the daughter of Germanicus gave her inevitability. Messalina was fire, but Agrippina was stone. Pallas preferred stone. Callistus, master of neutrality, played his usual game of letting others bleed first. Meanwhile, outside the palace, The Senate, resentful of Claudius's freedmen, wary of Messalina's interventions, needed only a pretext to amplify their suspicion into accusation. Silius provided it. A beautiful man linked to a visible empress. The stage directions wrote themselves. And then there is the marriage. Tacitus insists it occurred. Juvenal, hungry for filth, revels in the details. Garlands, vows, a bedded night, while Claudius still ruled. Historians, with centuries of distance, hesitate. Was it a true ceremony? A Bacchic rite later recast as political treason? A symbolic binding meant to formalize loyalty to Britannicus? Or an invention by Narcissus, carefully planted in the emperor's ear when absence made suspicion plausible? The truth is unrecoverable. But the usefulness of the tale was undeniable. Rome loved symbolic gestures because they could be read in multiple registers. To some, a ritual could look like piety. To others, treason. By accusing Messalina of marriage to Silius, her enemies gave the story its richest fuel. It was not merely infidelity, it was usurpation. To marry another man while the emperor lived was to crown him in all but name. It gave Narcissus exactly the narrative he needed. Not an ambitious woman maneuvering for her son's safety, but a monster whose desire could dismantle the empire. Timing made it fatal. Claudius was away in Ostia, inspecting the harbor works that would feed the city and secure his reputation as a builder. His absence left Messalina vulnerable. The freedmen controlled the channels of news, and Narcissus seized them. Messengers galloped with selective information. The emperor, already uncertain, already aware that his wife's reputation was a battlefield, was presented not with a question, but a verdict. It is worth pausing here to examine the irony. Claudius, mocked in his youth as a fool, had proven himself capable of reforms, conquests, and rulings that lasted. Yet, in the one sphere where clarity was most needed, his own household, he remained pliable clay in the hands of those who interpreted events for him. The scholar who read deeply in law and history could not read the motives of those nearest him. Messalina, in this void, became a figure others could define at will. The alleged wedding was narrated as spectacle. Roses and wine, vows before gods, laughter spilling through the streets. It is almost too theatrical, as though Tacitus himself could not resist staging the scene as tragedy disguised as comedy. But whether the event happened or not, the image was enough. In Rome, images governed reality. To accuse was to create. To repeat was to confirm. Soon the city's ears were ringing with certainty. The empress had crowned a lover in her husband's absence. For Messalina, the danger was not simply that the story circulated. It was that it circulated at a moment when her enemies had aligned. Narcissus saw an opportunity to preserve his indispensability. Pallas, leaning toward Agrippina, had no reason to defend her. Senators, tired of her interventions, were eager to believe the worst. And Claudius, caught between bewilderment and fatigue, was inclined to accept what was easiest to accept: that betrayal had occurred, and that swift punishment would cleanse it. Silius, for all his beauty, was not invulnerable. He knew the game. When accusations sharpened, he did not plead innocence. He offered to renounce his marriage, to surrender his wealth, to make himself a sacrifice so the emperor could walk away untarnished. It was too late. Once the story had grown this large, no retraction could contain it. Rome had already begun rehearsing its favorite ritual: the purification of the state by blood. Messalina's enemies had managed what all conspirators dream of. They turned a rumor into a weapon without ever proving its substance. They had cast her not merely as an adulteress, but as a usurper, a woman who dared to play the emperor while the emperor still breathed. In that transformation lay her doom. The garden waited. But before we walk there again, we should linger on the larger truth. This was never only about Messalina. It was about what Rome permitted women to be and what it punished them for becoming. To influence was tolerable. To wield power openly was intolerable. To protect a son's succession was natural. To use politics to do so was monstrous. Messalina's alleged marriage crystallized every Roman fear about female agency into a single story. And once crystallized, it could not be dissolved. In the next act, we will watch how that story hardened into decree, and how the Empress of Rome found herself cornered not by her actions alone, but by the machinery of accusation perfected long before she was born. Power in Rome never fell by accident. It was always pushed. Messalina's collapse was not a sudden storm, but a storm steered. Her enemies had been waiting for the right moment, and when Claudius left the city for Ostia to inspect the vast harbor project that would feed the capital, they saw their chance. The emperor was away, distracted by the logistics of grain and stone. His absence meant he was dependent on the voices nearest to him. And those voices belonged to men who had already written her obituary. Narcissus was first among them. For years he had been Claudius's shield and interpreter, the one who turned confusion into clarity, who distilled the chaos of petitions into simple choices. But influence is a fragile currency. If Messalina bound herself too closely to Silius, Narcissus would be diminished. In the theater of Roman politics, diminished men rarely lived long, and so he acted with precision. The story he carried to Claudius was not gentle rumor, it was thunder. Messalina, he said, had betrayed the emperor not only with a lover, but with a rival husband. She had crowned another man in a mockery of vows. She had placed the empire itself at risk, and she had done it in full daylight, before witnesses, as though the emperor's authority were already a corpse. It was treason, dressed as lust, performed as theater. Claudius wavered. This was his nature. His intelligence was broad, but his confidence brittle. He asked for proof. Narcissus obliged. Witnesses were summoned, men who owed their careers to the freedmen and who repeated the lines rehearsed for them. They had seen the garlands, heard the vows, watched the farce unfold. The evidence was not evidence. It was performance, but it satisfied the emperor's unease. Still, Claudius hesitated. This was his wife, the mother of his children, the empress whose image had been struck on coins beside his own. To condemn her outright was to condemn himself for blindness. He muttered, equivocated, stalled. Here Narcissus showed his genius. He did not argue with Claudius. He argued with Rome. He reminded the emperor that hesitation itself was dangerous. The city already whispered. To delay was to look complicit. If Claudius did not act, the Senate might. And if the Senate acted, it would not be only Messalina who fell. Meanwhile, in Rome, Messalina heard the sound of her own ruin gathering speed. The story of her alleged marriage raced faster than she could counter it. She ran through the streets, barefoot according to later retellings, her hair undone. A gesture of mourning performed for herself while still alive. She rushed to allies, to soldiers, to friends she believed might intervene. But alliances made in banquets rarely survive the daylight of scandal. Doors closed, voices fell silent. To help her was to implicate oneself. Rome's citizens, trained to sniff danger like smoke, pulled back from her as though she were plague. In desperation, she tried to reach Claudius directly. Some accounts say she stormed toward the road to Ostia, hoping to intercept him before Narcissus's poison fully sank in. Others say she flung herself at the feet of Octavia's tutor or Britannicus's guardians, begging them to speak on her behalf. The image is almost unbearable. An empress of Rome reduced to a supplicant in her own city, while men rehearsed her guilt in marble halls. Claudius, for his part, was not entirely lost to her. Tacitus tells us that when he first heard of her supposed betrayal, he muttered words that sounded almost like forgiveness. "Let the woman live." These are perhaps the truest lines in the entire story. They show the emperor's instinct, not to destroy, but to pardon. But Narcissus understood that instinct, and he was prepared for it. The freedman placed Claudius in a carriage, hurried him back toward the city, and kept him busy with carefully chosen companions who recited Messalina's crimes until repetition hardened into truth. Along the way, Claudius asked more than once, "Why would my wife do this?" It was not the question of a ruler certain of betrayal. It was the question of a husband bewildered by accusation. Narcissus, refusing the question's humanity, fed him only answers of treason and lust. By the time they reached Rome, Claudius was exhausted. The Senate, sensing an opportunity, pressed for action. Narcissus took command, knowing that speed would smother mercy. He convinced Claudius that delay meant rebellion, that hesitation meant danger. And when the emperor once again faltered, once again leaned toward sparing her, Narcissus acted without waiting for imperial consent. Messalina was seized and carried to the Gardens of Lucullus, the same place where she had once strolled in triumph, hosting feasts under awnings of purple silk. Now the gardens were a prison. She understood. She asked for an audience with Claudius, one final chance to defend herself. It was denied. Narcissus had engineered her silence. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, stood with her. Tacitus describes her urging her daughter to die with dignity, to take her own life rather than submit to the blade of a stranger. Messalina faltered. Strength deserted her at the edge. When the centurion raised his sword, she could not guide it herself. The soldier finished the work. She was 24 years old. At dinner that night, Claudius asked, almost absently, if his wife had been executed. When told she had, he nodded and asked for more wine. Was it shock? Was it relief? Or was it the performance of a man who had chosen to forget quickly what was too painful to remember? The sources disagree, but Rome did not. Rome agreed on one thing only. Messalina was gone, and with her went a chapter the city preferred to remember as cautionary myth rather than as tragedy engineered. The machinery had worked. A freedman preserved his indispensability. A senate cleansed its resentments. Agrippina's path cleared. The child Britannicus lost his shield. And history acquired another story of a woman destroyed not only by what she may have done, but by what others needed her to have done. The fall was not natural. It was constructed. And once constructed, it was passed down as inevitability. The blade fell in the gardens, and with it fell a woman who had stood at the center of Rome's most dangerous circle. But the execution was not the end. It was the beginning of something colder. Messalina did not vanish with her breath. She was made to vanish systematically, as though erasure itself were policy. In Rome, death was never enough. You had to be forgotten. Claudius, so indecisive before the act, became strangely absent afterward. The sources describe him at a banquet, asking midway through his meal whether the deed had been done. When told it had, he nodded as if relieved of an inconvenience and returned to his cup. Was this the detachment of shock, or the instinct of survival? A refusal to dwell on what he could not undo? Tacitus, always eager for irony, presents it as a grotesque calm. Perhaps it was nothing more than exhaustion. An emperor who had been maneuvered by his own servants into killing his wife, and now sought only silence. Silence, however, was not neutral. It was policy. Messalina's name was condemned to oblivion. The Senate decreed her damnatio memoriae, her memory struck from inscriptions, her statues toppled, her likeness hammered from coins where it appeared beside Claudius or Britannicus. The Romans, masters of ritual, understood that to erase a name was to murder twice, once in the flesh, once in the story. Yet the attempt at erasure had the opposite effect. Where her face was chipped away, rumor filled the space. Where her name was scratched from marble, gossip engraved it deeper into imagination. Her children remained, and with them, the paradox of her destruction. Octavia, solemn and unyielding, would live long enough to be forced into marriage with Nero, and years later, to die for it. Britannicus, boy heir, stood briefly at the center of the empire's future. He was named on coins, sung of in loyalty oaths, trained for a role he would never play. Messalina's death had cut him in half. Still a prince, but without the protection of the mother who had fought to preserve his succession. The void did not last long. Into it stepped Agrippina, older, steelier, daughter of Germanicus. She had weathered exile under Caligula and returned with a scarred wisdom that Rome mistook for destiny. In 49 CE, a year after Messalina's execution, she married Claudius, her uncle by blood, her emperor by rank. The union scandalized some, but silenced most. Agrippina brought with her a son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, whom she soon renamed Nero, aligning him with imperial lineage. From that moment, Britannicus's eclipse was only a matter of time. Agrippina mastered the art of positioning herself where Claudius's uncertainty was thickest. She flattered his scholarship, guided his decrees, and placed Nero in view of the Senate and the soldiers until his presence felt like inevitability. Britannicus was still young, still marked as heir by birthright, but Rome no longer believed in birthright alone. Rome believed in the power of whoever could command the room. And Agrippina, unlike Messalina, had learned to command without appearing to do so. Narcissus, who had orchestrated Messalina's fall, found himself trapped in irony. He had removed the empress he feared, only to discover that the replacement was far more dangerous. Agrippina did not need lovers to build power. She needed only discipline and memory. Pallas, who had bet on her rise, flourished briefly. Callistus stayed quiet as ever. But Narcissus, once indispensable, began to fade in usefulness. He had gambled and survived, but survival is not triumph. Meanwhile, the ghost of Messalina lingered. Her story, retold in Senate corridors and tavern stalls alike, hardened into moral allegory. She was invoked as the emblem of unrestrained desire. The woman who destroyed herself because she could not be satisfied. Never mind that the evidence for this came from satire and invention. Never mind that her true crime may have been ambition on behalf of her son. Rome wanted an example, and she provided it. Her name became shorthand for the dangers of female agency. To call a woman a Messalina was to condemn her as both adulteress and conspirator, whether or not she resembled the original. Yet if we look beneath the smear, we see a darker truth. Messalina was sacrificed to preserve the empire's balance. Her enemies did not kill her because she loved too much. They killed her because she mattered too much. Her youth, her alliances, her children, these made her pivotal, and therefore intolerable. Agrippina's rise required her absence. The Senate's resentment required her scapegoating. Narcissus's survival required her ruin. In that convergence, no woman could have survived. And so, the years marched forward. In 55 CE, Britannicus, Messalina's son, the rightful heir, was poisoned during a banquet. Tacitus, ever sharp with irony, records that his death was dismissed as an epileptic fit. Few believed it. Fewer dared to question Nero's ascension. Octavia, forced into marriage with Nero, endured humiliation and abuse until, in 62 CE, she was exiled and executed, her death a quieter echo of her mother's fate. Messalina's bloodline was erased step by step, just as her name had been erased from monuments. But erasure is a fragile thing. The more Rome tried to bury her, the more her story spread. Poets, satirists, and later historians could not resist the figure of the empress who burned too brightly and too dangerously. Juvenal wielded her as a weapon in his tirades against female vice. Later centuries turned her into art, painted as a siren, staged as a symbol of decadence, remembered not for what she truly was, but for what Rome needed her to represent. This was the true aftermath. Not only her death, but the theft of her identity. Messalina was made into a parable, stripped of her complexities, reduced to appetite. The real woman, mother, politician, survivor of Rome's cruel court, was lost behind a mask of lust and betrayal. The mask endured because it was useful. History does not remember evenly. Some lives are preserved in marble inscriptions and triumphal arches. Others survive only as caricature. Messalina, condemned in life, became immortal in mockery. The Roman state erased her statues, but Roman writers resurrected her as a symbol. It was not the woman they remembered. It was the weapon she provided. The first architect of her ruin was Tacitus. Writing nearly 70 years after her death, he shaped her into a lesson: how corruption seeps from the palace into the bloodstream of empire. His annals are masterpieces of moral architecture, but they are not court transcripts. Tacitus's Messalina is a figure of excess, her lust insatiable, her cunning reckless. He recounts her supposed contests with prostitutes, her nocturnal escapades, her brazen marriage to Silius. Yet even as he condemns her, one can hear the undertone of craft. These tales are too neat, too perfectly scandalous to be pure recollection. They are allegory. Messalina becomes less a woman than a stage device in his broader drama of Julio-Claudian decay. Suetonius, writing soon after, indulged his taste for gossip. His lives of the Caesars are notorious for their lurid details, the kinds of anecdotes whispered in corridors and repeated at banquets until they hardened into truth. For him, Messalina is little more than salacious entertainment, a woman whose private vices spilled over into public catastrophe. Where Tacitus uses her as a moral signpost, Suetonius uses her as spectacle. Juvenal, the satirist, was harsher still. His aim was not history but invective. He needed monsters to personify Rome's moral collapse, and Messalina offered him a ready-made demon. In his satires, she becomes the empress who leaves her palace bed to prostitute herself in the city's brothels, competing with harlots until dawn. It is theater, sharpened with misogyny, designed to shock male audiences into laughter or outrage. Yet Juvenal's venom, because it was memorable, cemented her reputation more firmly than any sober account could have. Centuries later, Dio Cassius, writing in Greek, recycled these traditions, adding his own embroidery. His Messalina is consistent with the caricature already established, evidence that once a woman's image was fixed in scandal, later historians felt no obligation to revisit it. She had become shorthand, not subject. Why this fixation on her body, her sexuality, her appetite? Because in Roman culture, sexual slander was political shorthand. To call a woman lustful was to call her unfit for influence. To say she was insatiable was to say she could not be trusted with power. A man's ambition might be framed as dangerous, but it was still recognized as political. A woman's ambition had to be translated into desire. Thus, Messalina was not allowed to be a strategist or a rival. She had to be a seductress, a monster of appetite. And yet, the very act of vilification ensured her survival. Many noble women of Rome passed through history with barely a mention. Messalina, because she was slandered, was remembered. Her name outlived those of the senators who condemned her, the freedmen who maneuvered her death, even Claudius himself. Rome tried to erase her in marble, but Rome's writers gave her eternal afterlife in ink. When Europe rediscovered the classics, the myth traveled forward. Renaissance moralists invoked Messalina as a warning against women's lust. Playwrights staged her as a femme fatale. Painters draped her in silks, placing her in half-lit bedrooms where desire and power tangled. In the 19th century, academic painters such as Eugène Delacroix and the followers of Bouguereau rendered her as voluptuous decadence, her name a shorthand for dangerous beauty. Each generation used her to embody its own anxieties, about morality, about gender, about power unchecked. The paradox is sharp. The attempt to erase Messalina's real life ensured that the legend of Messalina would never die. By condemning her, the Romans preserved her. By slandering her, they guaranteed her fascination. Every whisper repeated across centuries amplified the caricature, until the woman herself disappeared behind it. And yet, the shadow hints at substance. Even through the accusations, one can glimpse fragments of the truth. A young woman tied by lineage to Rome's founding dynasty, married at 15 to a man decades her senior, navigating a court thick with rivals and daggers. She bore children who were heirs, exercised influence in appointments, and maneuvered in a system that punished women for doing what men did daily. That reality is harder to paint than the myth, but it is the one that matters. The legend of Messalina tells us less about her than about Rome. It tells us how the empire needed its women to be symbols, mothers of heirs, ornaments of virtue, cautionary tales of vice. It tells us how accusations of lust served as shorthand for political resentment. And it tells us how memory, once corrupted, can outlast marble and law alike. Messalina is dead. She has been dead for nearly 2,000 years, but her story has never rested. Each age exhumes her, dresses her in its own anxieties, and sends her back to the stage. For Rome, she was lust incarnate. For the Renaissance, she was the eternal harlot. For the Victorians, she was the parable of decadence. Even today, her name slips into headlines and novels as shorthand for dangerous desire. Yet, if we strip away the embellishments, we are left with an uncomfortable silence. Who was she really? The historian searching for Messalina confronts absence. No letters in her hand, no speeches recorded, no contemporary testimony that escapes the filters of bias. The coins that bore her image are mute. The statues that once honored her were shattered. What we have are voices of men who despised her or needed her to be despised. Tacitus writing in the early 2nd century, Suetonius compiling scandal, Juvenal spitting satire, Cassius reshaping older tales. They give us not Messalina, but a construct. And yet, within the hostility, a pattern emerges. A pattern that tells us more about Rome's politics than about her body. Consider how accusations cluster around the same themes: adultery, prostitution, insatiable desire. These were not neutral charges. They were weapons honed for women. In Rome's moral code, a man's overreach might be called ambition, even tyranny. A woman's overreach had to be recast as lust. It was the only language the culture allowed for explaining female agency. Modern scholarship has begun to unravel this. Barbara Levick, in her study of Claudius, suggests that many of Messalina's alleged crimes were ordinary court maneuvers, the kind practiced by every imperial household. Catherine Edwards has shown how Roman rhetoric systematically linked female power to immorality, using sexual slander to delegitimize women. Anthony Barrett, in his work on Agrippina, situates Messalina's fall within the larger chessboard of succession. Her destruction cleared the path for Agrippina and Nero. None of these historians claim Messalina was innocent of ambition, but they restore her to humanity rather than caricature. What emerges is a woman trapped in a double bind. To remain passive was to vanish. To act was to be condemned. Married at 15, crowned empress before 20, she was thrown into an empire where survival demanded calculation. She maneuvered, she eliminated rivals, she pressed her influence into appointments. Men called it depravity. Yet when Agrippina did much the same, cloaked in restraint, history judged her with grudging respect. The contrast tells us the truth. Messalina was punished not for being different, but for being visible. Her end was swift because it had to be. A mother of heirs, tied by blood to Augustus, she was too central to leave in disgrace. To kill her was to stabilize the court. To erase her memory was to prevent her from being a rallying figure. And so, she became the first empress to be condemned in Rome's imagination as a monster of lust, a role others would inherit, but none embody so thoroughly. The legacy is brutal. Britannicus, the son she fought to protect, was poisoned at 14. Octavia, her daughter, forced to marry Nero, was later murdered on false charges of adultery. The Julio-Claudian dynasty devoured its own children, and Messalina's line was extinguished with them. Yet her ghost endured, more persistent than marble. Walk today among the ruins of the Palatine, and you can almost hear the echo of the stories. Guides speak her name as scandal. Tourists laugh nervously, repeating tales Juvenal would recognize. But in the silence between the words, something else lingers. A question. What if the truth was not debauchery, but desperation? What if the marriage to Silius, whether real or ritual, was not lust unbound, but a last attempt to secure Britannicus's survival in a court turning against him? What if her so-called insatiability was the language Rome used for influence it could not accept? We cannot know with certainty. The evidence has been too carefully curated by her enemies. But perhaps certainty is not the point. Perhaps the lesson of Messalina is not who she was, but how history works, how it devours women, how it turns their power into sin, how it repeats lies until they harden into monuments. At the end of her life, in the Gardens of Lucullus, she stood silent before the sword. Tacitus records that she did not beg, that she met her death with a kind of stillness her enemies had not anticipated. That silence may be the truest thing we know about her. She refused to give them words they could use. Her story forces us to ask, who decides what survives? Who writes the tales that turn people into monsters? And when we inherit these tales centuries later, what is our duty? To repeat them or to peel them apart, searching for the woman beneath? Messalina remains a question, mark carved into Roman history. Not the prostitute of Juvenal, not the harlot of Suetonius, not even the reckless conspirator of Tacitus. but something more complicated. A young woman, crowned too early, maneuvering in a system designed to consume her. A mother who fought for her son. An empress undone by the machinery of fear. In the end, her life is a mirror. When we look at her, we see less of Messalina than of Rome itself. The empire's hunger for control, its fear of women, its talent for turning scandal into order. And beyond Rome, we see ourselves, inheritors of stories we did not write, tasked with asking whether we will let them stand as truth, or dare to question whose voices have survived and whose have been silenced. Messalina's life, brief and blazing, still whispers through the ruins. Not everything you've heard is true. The Gardens of Lucullus are quiet now. Tourists wander the paths with cameras, not swords. The fountains murmur, and the cypresses stand like sentinels, their shadows long and indifferent. Yet the air here still remembers. It remembers the night when an empress of Rome stood at the edge of power and silence. It remembers the sword. It remembers the scream that never came. Messalina's death was not loud. It was erased. And in that erasure lies the paradox of her legacy. Rome tried to silence her, but the silence itself became a scream that echoed through centuries, carried not in marble inscriptions, but in the stories of those who despised her. She survived in slander, her name twisted into a curse. But perhaps that is why she still haunts us. Because we know deep down that what survives is not always what was true. Her story is not isolated. It is part of a pattern Rome perfected. Cleopatra was reduced to seduction, her diplomacy erased. Agrippina was remembered as a schemer, though she played the same game as every senator. Boudica, who led armies against Roman conquest, was cast as a barbarian, her leadership stripped of reason. Each of these women was rewritten to fit the empire's fear. That female power was unnatural, dangerous, corrupting. Messalina was simply the most vivid canvas for that fear. And so, the sources insist, she was insatiable. She prostituted herself in the streets. She staged a mock wedding while her husband ruled. She was a monster of appetite, a warning to all who came after. But if we peel back the words, what remains? A woman born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, married at 15, mother of 2 imperial heirs, forced to survive in a court where ambition was the only currency and betrayal the only certainty. A woman who maneuvered, plotted, defended her children. A woman who lost the game because she played too visibly. The silence at her end is the most powerful detail. Tacitus, who cannot resist dramatizing, admits she did not beg. Juvenal, whose pen drips venom, cannot erase that fact. She faced death with the one weapon still hers: refusal. She gave them no words to twist, no cries to echo as proof of her shame. In the garden where her enemies believed they were destroying her, she preserved the one thing Rome could not erase: dignity. What do we do with that silence? Do we repeat the old tales? Or do we honor the absence by asking what it conceals? Messalina's story is not simply about one empress. It is about how history is written, how voices are erased, how myths replace people. It is about the cruelty of memory, the ease with which slander outlives truth. Walk through the ruins of Rome, and you will see her absence everywhere. Her statues are gone, her name chiseled away. But listen closely. The stones whisper. They whisper that history belongs to those who write it. And that silence is often the only thing left to the accused. They whisper that Messalina was not the monster Juvenal painted, nor the fool Tacitus mocked, but a woman caught in a system designed to consume her. Perhaps this is why her story still matters. Because in her silence, we hear the screams of all who have been misremembered, all whose lives were bent into allegory by those in power. Messalina stands for the danger of letting enemies write history unchecked. She stands for the need to question every tale handed down to us as truth. And she stands, above all, as a reminder that power punishes women differently, by turning their ambition into vice, their agency into scandal, their survival into monstrosity. The end of her life was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a legend Rome thought would bury her, but which instead immortalized her in cautionary whispers. Yet we, standing centuries later, can choose differently. We can listen not just to the slander, but to the silence. We can see her not as the harlot of satire, nor as the empress of marble, but as a woman whose life was brief, blazing, and misunderstood. Messalina's silent scream still hangs in the air of Rome. It is not the scream of lust, nor of treason, but of erasure itself. And it asks us one question, one that echoes across history. When the voices of the condemned are lost, will we believe the stories of their executioners?